Welcome everyone to session 4, workshop number 13, in which we will listen in on how to trust the experts in our classroom. We will learn about what our students have to teach us about authenticity, audience, purpose, and voice. So this session is presented by Alex Corbitt, a middle school teacher from the Bronx in New York. Jason Griffith, a former middle and high school English teacher and author of From Me to We, using narrative, nonfiction to broaden student perspectives. And Dr. Good morning, or good afternoon, is it? Wherever you are, it's morning. Perfect, that's right. And we also have Dr. Shanetia Clark, an associate professor of literacy in the teacher education department at Salisbury University, who's published articles and book chapters on children and young adult literature. So don't forget to include the following hashtag on Twitter to join the conversation. Hashtag the EdCollabGathering, space, hashtag 13. All right, take it away.
Cool. Thank you so much, Diana, for facilitating, and Chris Lehman and everybody at the EdCollab for having us. As we get started, just to kind of build off of what Diana said about Twitter, if you want to reach out to us with questions or comments just to kind of add to the conversation, you can tweet out to our our usernames. Jason is at jgriff_teach, and Shanetia is at UVA_graduate, and I'm Alex_Corbitt. So thank you so much for being with us, and we're so excited to have you here. So Jason, if you go to the next slide, what I'm going to talk about today about trusting the students as experts is really kind of centering student voice in the classroom. And my presentation is titled Teen Activism Centering Student Voice. I've had the honor this year and the flexibility from my administration to be able to facilitate a teen activism class in my 8th period. And it's a group of about 16 students, and we meet 4 times a week to discuss activism issues. And I created and designed this class as a way to kind of merge literacy and social justice, and to push my practice, having students really drive the trajectory of the class. So to build upon that a little bit more in the next slide, over the summer, as I was planning the course, I thought of it as like a 5-step trajectory. And I actually borrowed from Jason's book this idea of going from me and thinking about ourselves and our experiences and our prior knowledge to we, a more kind of global, empathetic, broader perspective. So as I was designing the class, starting off with the first step, community building, the students kind of created group norms, how the course was going to be run, how I would not always be leading everything, and the students could take charge. As you see in the picture, that's one of my students doing the goal setting step, which is actually the second step, where the students created all the ideas for units that we would explore. As we go from unit to unit, the third step, storytelling, our students would connect with each unit and inquiry and topic by first reflecting on their prior knowledge of the unit and how they connected to the idea. Fourth step is information gathering, and that is where we're reading different texts and analyzing. A lot of actually documentary film is a big part of our course. And then step 5, and that's really what I'm going to be discussing most today, is taking action, where after we've decided on a unit topic, we then consume the different and analyze the different texts, and then think, how can we then take our learning, share it out beyond the classroom walls, and be activistic. And so what I'm going to share with you guys today is 3 different projects that we've worked on that center student voice, center student prior knowledge, and kind of extend learning beyond the classroom. And that's one way I've been really trying to push my practice this year. So the first project that we worked on, in the next slide, we started at the beginning of the year, and the first unit that we kind of investigated was racism in society. And coming from the summertime into the school year. There was the election still going on, and students really were concerned about racial tensions and kind of exclusion in our society. So we investigated racism, and our texts were, we watched 13th, the documentary about the prison industrial complex inspired from Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. We watched Two Fists Up, which is a Spike Lee film that talks about college campuses and racism. And then Precious Knowledge, which is about students advocating for Latino studies in the Tucson, Arizona school district. And so after watching these 3 films and reading some other articles, the students created where they would interview each other and create those discussions into a podcast. They used GarageBand, they used their phones to record it, and this is a way to capture and synthesize their learning in a way that's easily shared out digitally beyond the classroom walls. So I have some of my students there talking, and that was a really great first step into activism. And then it became a little bit richer in our next unit as we go to the next slide. In future units, we discussed, after racism, we discussed animal rights, we discussed nutrition, we discussed bullying and mental health. And my students came up with the idea of creating an underground newspaper, almost like 1970s punk zine style. And so the way it worked, and I actually have the original copy here, so let me, hopefully you can see it okay. They created a collage in the background on just like construction paper, and then based on what we had talked about and their own experiences and their own perspectives, they wrote a lot of poetry, prose, little inspirational quotes, and pasted them on top of this collage. They called the zine Whisper, and this is our first issue that I'm showing here. It's a double-sided, and they even created their own Gmail account where other people outside of the activism club could contribute anonymously to this underground newspaper. After we finished creating it, at the end of the school day, after everyone left, we kind of like closed the doors and peered out of the classroom. We went from locker to locker and stuffed all the lockers with copies, photocopied versions of the zine. And then the next day, it was almost like a viral campaign. As everyone opened up their lockers, they got to see these like anonymous writings, and all the students signed off their writing under a code name. And of course, I teach 7th grade. This is a very like edgy, kind of exciting way that the students wanted to kind of share their feelings. And now we have the capability to receive writings from other students and really create an inclusive dialogue in the school community. And I think that's so important because it really pushes back against the dialogue that our country is having, which is not inclusive. And this is very authentic in that way. My students want to take it a step further. And in the next slide, they created, watch out, it's creepy, I apologize. They wanted to take the idea of the underground newspaper and turn it into something a little bit more visually appealing and interactive. So they created this idea of Whisper TV, because the zine is called Whisper, so this would be Whisper TV. And this unit was less of like one cohesive, coherent topic, and my students decided to do more research. So I had one group who researched racism in school and university settings. One group researched ICE. Another group researched the immigration ban, and now the second immigration ban that was being discussed. And then fourth, another group, which is actually the group featured here in this picture, researched misogyny and patriarchy. And so the idea behind this project that my students kind of thought up was to create like a 3-minute video in the vein of Anonymous and V for Vendetta, if you've seen V for Vendetta, the movie. And those groups, like the hacktivist group Anonymous, they utilize this this medium of getting information out as a way to be kind of subversive and rebellious and to wake up people throughout the country about issues. And my students love that, and they wanted to participate in that same kind of work. So here we filmed the group that talked about misogyny and patriarchy, and they wrote a script based on all the research they'd done. They actually shouted out "Speak" by Lori Halls Anderson, and did like a mini book talk within the presentation, which was really cute. And then what we can do as we're finishing up creating these videos, share them out with the different homeroom teachers to give, to play during homeroom class. So these are 3 projects that we developed with students to, again, center their voice, center their experience, center the way they want to communicate. And I hope, I was actually just speaking with Jason and Shanetia earlier, my hope is that we can take this activism and make it less private and anonymous and more public. And, you know, this is who I am, this is where I come from, my experience, and why activism means a lot to me. But for right now, this is where my students are at, and trying to honor that and see what new forms it takes throughout the rest of the school year. Just as I finish up, the last slide, I'm just going to recommend a few really inform my thinking that I think would be very helpful if this is work that you're interested in doing. Obviously, Rethinking Schools, it's a magazine publication, but they also put out a wide array of incredible books, not just about literacy, but also math and connecting those content areas with social justice. Every year they come out with a planner that includes resources to other social justice groups. Jason, who you're going to hear from next, wrote From Me to We, which is all about memoir. He'll speak to that, but again, centering student experiences. In the most recent issue of Voices from the Middle Journal, Alagbemi Sola, Rude Perkovich wrote an incredible article on diverse literature and empowering students' voice and identity. And for those of you guys who haven't read it, For White Folks Who Teach in the Hood by Chris Emdin's incredible, and talks about co-generative dialogue and, again, centering students. So these are some texts that have really informed my learning, that are pushing my thinking, and I just always like to shout out those incredible people. So as I finish up, thank you so much, guys. Don't forget to tweet out to Jason, Shanetia, and I, and I'll throw it over to Jason.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, that was really good. Give you a minute to get the slides up here. So good morning, gathering audience in the Twitterverse. Coffee cheers from Phoenix, Arizona, where it's still the morning. So if you're on the East Coast, we're in different boundaries of the day here. So I'm looking forward to sharing with you some thoughts about the personal essay. So I call this time it's personal. So I'm trying to share some student insight from my students about what it was like to write personally, specifically a personal essay as part of our 10th grade class. So if you jump to the next slide, Alex. I'm currently in kind of a strange space because I moved, I'm in my 2nd year of a PhD program in English Ed at Arizona State, after teaching 8th grade and 10th grade English for 12 years. So I'm still pretty close to some of the ideas and projects and content that I was really excited about in my classroom, but I'm also starting to transition into the role of a teacher educator and a literacy researcher. So I'm also kind of looking back at some of those practices and trying to do some research about what was special about them, what worked, what didn't work, future questions. And one of those aspects for me, I consider myself a writer, a reader, as many of you all good English teachers are, right? And one of my personal interests is creative nonfiction. So true stories, well told, as the tagline of Creative Nonfiction magazine is. So as that, I wanted to bring that interest into the classroom, because since I had a passion for it, I thought that could translate to students. But I ran into this problem, which I'm sure some of you all have experienced, which Penny Kittle labels narrative disrespect on the next slide. So narrative disrespect, if you're familiar with David Coleman, the president of the College Board, he infamously said in a speech that's been often quoted since then in 2011 to the New York State Education Department, he was talking about the context of personal writing and personal sharing. And he said, as you grow up in this world, you realize people don't really give a bleep about what you feel or what you think. Right. So this is kind of indicative of this kind of thinking that Penny Kittle in an editorial called Narrative Disrespect. And the only problem with narrative disrespect is that to categorize narrative as just another genre, like in contrast to informational and persuasive, Tom Newkirk said in Minds Made for Stories that separation is a miscategorization. He said, as you can see there, narrative is a form or mode of discourse that can be used for multiple purposes. We use narrative to inform. We use narrative to make an argument or persuade. We use it to entertain. We use it to express. It's the mother of all modes. It's a powerful and innate form of understanding. So in the next slide, if we flip this around and start talking about narrative respect, another thing that comes into the argument is the state of the literary landscape. So I know Shanetia and Alex are fans of S-Town. I just listened to episode 3 last night. Great narrative nonfiction with a personal bent. Of course, Serial is, especially the first season, in my opinion. The Moth is super popular in live storytelling events across the country. This American Life is a staple from which Serial and S-Town have grown. So podcasts like that featuring narrative nonfiction. Then there's television shows. Alex mentioned some great documentaries. There's also the television shows like ESPN's 30 for 30 series, Netflix is Making a Murderer. Then there's a whole pattern of, like most recently, I think Hidden Figures is the best example of something that fits this pattern. But the many nonfiction books, narrative nonfiction books that have been adapted into a based on a true story film. So we just keep seeing a slew of those are story-based nonfiction books that get transformed into film. So we see this in contrast to David Coleman's statement that nobody cares what we think or feel. We see this huge influx of personal kind of singular account, singular storytelling that's super, super popular from literacy consumers. So then we also ask the question, like, what about the overlap between narrative and academic? For example, gateway genres like the college essay, the college interview. What about incorporating personal anecdote into argument? The reason we're passionate about the issues that we are, kind of our personal stance, right? What about using personal experience as an introduction to research or informational writing, as we often see in things like the iSearch paper? So it's kind of with this reasoning that I got lucky, and I was able to sway my department chair to support adding a narrative nonfiction unit to my 10th grade curriculum. So with that, we set up a pattern where students read one of those narrative nonfiction books that had been turned into a film, and we did a whole kind of reading, viewing, critical literacy unit around that, and it culminated in the writing of a personal essay at the end, kind of putting those things into practice from a mentor text. So I outlined that on the next slide in my very first book, which Alex so graciously plugged in his session, which came out from Routledge back in September. And I encourage you to check this out. This has all sorts of great resources and strategies for memoir writing, as Alex said, but also the other aspects of narrative nonfiction, like literary journalism and some different critical reading activities, which then jump into critical writing activities. So I think there's a link on the EdCollab site that you can click on if you're interested. You can search for it on routledge.com or also on Amazon. It's called From Me to We, Using Narrative Nonfiction to Broaden Student Perspectives. But that's my story, right? So jumping to the next slide, I can judge that unit a success. Once we got done in my 10th grade, I judged it a success in the same way that teachers judge their units a success. I looked across the board at all my student writing samples. I saw vulnerable and interesting topics. I saw engaged and powerful writing. I saw the effective use of hallmarks of the creative nonfiction genre, specifically use of scenes, use of dialogue, use of active voice, combining plot plus reflection. So I thought it was successful, but one of the things that kept popping up in discussion, especially in my PhD program, is kind of how much of an imposition it might be to ask students to write personally, especially as part of class, especially to require it. And I started talking with someone, with folks that talked about how there's some teachers that don't do personal writing at all because they're worried that it'll be an imposition. They're worried that students will be forced to share something they're not comfortable with. So it's kind of like, working on this idea, looking at it as a successful unit, that I started to conduct some follow-up study and into the experience of students who wrote this personal essay and participated in this unit. So I highlighted two specific students who I contacted and conducted in-depth follow-up interviews with. And these were two folks that, in my opinion, were at the top of the list in terms of for quality for two reasons. One, they wrote about incredibly personally vulnerable topics, and two, they were high quality essay writing based on the above mentioned genre hallmarks. So these two students chose the pseudonyms for our IRB approval as Juliet and Elise, and they were 10th grade students who did this unit with me, who are looking back as 12th graders actually on this unit and kind of what it meant to them. So in the next slide, as I started working through and these in-depth interviews, there were a couple of interesting kind of discoveries and reflections. Way more than I can share here, but I'll try to at least give some glimpses into their experience. So first of all, this kind of flies in the face of modern criticism of millennials being viewed as selfish or self-centered or narcissistic, because what both of these students clearly communicated to me is that they didn't see, when I first assigned this personal essay, they didn't see their stories as exceptional. So you can see Juliet's quote there, everyone's major complaint is that nothing important has happened, because I think it's that when we compare our own lives and things we've gone through to all of these big, major, impactful events that we see every day, we kind of think, well, I'm not living that life, I'm not famous, I haven't had any major tragedies, and we just kind of not necessarily belittle our own experience, but we just don't consider them in the same way. And there was a parallel in Elisa's transcript where she said, at that point in my life, I had already experienced a lot of things, but nothing really major. It's not like I'd ever been married before and could write about my wedding day, or it's not like I'd ever had kids or could write about my first child. So it was kind of difficult in that respect to choose something. So you can see that these students didn't see that they had any stories worth sharing until on the next slide, they both kind of talked about in their process, they reached a sort of revelation or epiphany. So Juliet said, hey, wait, I did this whole thing. I had all these different experiences in middle school, and I saw these things, and then I went through this whole rough time, and I realized, wait, I pretty much became a different person. I think I just chose it, meaning her topic, because it was the first thing that I thought about it was almost like an epiphany. So in this point of kind of working through these experiences that she didn't think were significant, she stumbled upon one eventually that she realized could be valuable for her to explore and maybe to an audience as well. And Elise said the same thing. She mentioned a trial and error period that she went through a whole bunch of different topics that just seemed kind of insignificant. And she wrote, I was at the point at 3 in the morning where I was like, you know what, I'm just going to go with it. And I wrote about something that was still happening to me at the time and something I was still grappling with. And I looked back at it and recognized the fact that at that point in my life, that was the most complete snapshot of who I was and what I was struggling with and what I was dealing with. And Elise called that the 3 a.m. thoughts. And she says that's what makes a good personal essay, is not going with something that's just kind of a standard self-glorifying high school prompt, but going with those 3 a.m. thoughts, those things that you're still wrestling with and that you're still struggling with. So in the next slide, one of the other interesting takeaways is that they all said, every student that I talked to said that the personal essay generated more personal investment from them than traditionally academic assignments. So Juliet said, for most academic writing, I just kind of fall into a normal formula of, okay, do I have a thesis? What do I want to say about it? What are the details? And I approach it formulaically, is what I'm saying. But when it comes to personal essays, it requires obviously a lot more introspection, and it requires me to toss the formula out the window and say, okay, I'm going to slow down. I'm going to choose my topic. I have to really think about what I want to say about it. I cared more about it than other essays, and I think you almost have to. And again, there was a parallel in Elisa's transcript when she said the narrative nonfiction essay had so much more personal investment because it was about you. It wasn't like you're writing a research paper on Napoleon Bonaparte in which you're writing about somebody else and you couldn't insert any of your own experiences, your personal opinions about it. It was purely factual. It wasn't, since it was so much about you and so much from your eyes, it became a part of you, I guess. And that was reciprocal. That personal investment generated more motivation and vice versa. They were more motivated to write the essay and put time and effort and into making it a quality essay. And that kind of jumped back to generating then more personal investment. So it was a really intriguing loop. Another discovery is that on the next slide, is that timing and trust were huge factors. So trust of the teacher and trust of peer reviewers who would hear this story, and that trust being tied to timing. So in that same article where Penny Kittle talked about narrative disrespect, she also said that the personal essay is often done as a get-to-know-you activity at the beginning of the year, which is fine for that purpose, but the beginning of the year isn't when students are going to be the most vulnerable because they haven't built up a relationship with you. That might be better later in the year after they have established a relationship with you and with their classmates. So this was something that factored into the essay transcripts as well. Lee said about me as her teacher, I'd already known you for like 6 months, and I knew that, like, not that like I wouldn't be graded harshly, but it's not like if I wrote something really crappy, like that'd be a 0. It'd be like, okay, let's work with this a little bit. Or if I wrote something that offended you, you wouldn't get super duper mad like some teachers would, you know. And then she talked about trust with peer review partners by saying, you told us beforehand we're going to be doing peer review, but you could choose who read your essay. If you only wanted your best friend to read it, that was fine. If you weren't going to be pressured to have anyone, like some random person that you don't know or somebody you don't like, read it, you know. And Juliet echoed, she said, I don't think necessarily that peer review is a bad thing, but I do think allowing for choice is really, really important in the context of a personal story. Okay, so on the next slide, just to, I could keep going on with these gems from the transcript, but there's really too many to share. So in the next couple slides, I've just synthesized a couple lists to end here. So one of the things that popped up again and again, building off the last insight, was in a narrative nonfiction unit, in personal writing in the secondary classroom, for students, controlling the level of sharing is key. So that means not limiting them to some specific prompt, but letting them choose the topic. Letting them choose their peer review partners, having an out in terms of sharing, like not forcing them to share a certain passage, not forcing them to share with random partners, choosing whether or not to go public. So I always, like I'm sure many of you, offer publishing opportunities, like the Scholastic Writing Contest is one of my favorite outlets, but not forcing that. Giving them a choice whether or not to publish that, and choosing if and how much to share at all points. Some of the factors on the next slide that students said led to their success. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped one. So in terms of benefits, though, this is what they did. This is what benefits they reaped from writing personally in class. They said this was an important assignment for them to document change in their life and to preserve important memories. They said that this assignment helped them prompt reflection about significant experiences they'd been through. They mentioned the process of reconstructing these events and examining them provided therapeutic benefit, and specifically in providing closure to things that they were still wrestling with. They said they came to a better understanding of themselves, and also vicariously through the people they wrote about and interacted with. So they also saw their pieces as potentially offering benefit to others, and that they generated empathy in terms of understanding where other people in their story kind of fit in from doing this. And my last slide here is just some of the tools that they said helped them be successful. They said writer's notebooks and doing prompts over time, like not just hitting them with one prompt, but doing a lot of prompts and lists over time through writer's notebooks that they could refer back to. And it was interesting, during our interviews, they were both able to look back. They both still had their 10th grade English notebooks a year and a half later, and could look back at specific activities we did that kind of prompted their thinking. There was also the use of mentor text, the fact that we started with a book. The one student said, Elise said that helped her to shift her essay, the focus of her essay, from herself to writing about another person. In her essay, it was about her sister. And the other person, we read an editorial about a fiction writer who had to write a memoir about what haunted him, and that was the mentor text for the other student that kind of provided an outline for which direction she'd go. As we already mentioned with the controlling the level of sharing, having a level of trust with the teacher and knowing that they wouldn't be judged and had the freedom to write about anything they wanted, and trusting their peer reviewers, which for them came from being able to choose those folks, controlling the level of sharing in terms of putting it out there and publishing, things like that. And in terms of the topic selection, the willingness to be honest, vulnerable, and introspective, and not kind of go for a cliche topic, which was just self-inflating. And one of the things that was really motivating for these two students was realizing their writing could help others. They were starting, even though they were kind of hesitant about sharing this publicly, they were thinking about specific friends and family members that could benefit from kind of knowing their personal testimonial and realizing that other people were going through similar things. Okay, so I'll end by just inviting, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to tweet them out at jgriff_teach with our hashtags there. And I'm getting a message too from our facilitator, Diana, mentioning a great resource for y'all, Amy Krauss Rosenthal's Encyclopedia of an Ordinary Life. And yeah, which is a textbook with that Amy wrote with her students, and it would be a good resource on this topic. So check out Amy Krauss Rosenthal's Encyclopedia of an Ordinary Life as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our final presenter, Shanetia.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm glad. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I'm excited to be here. Cheers from Annapolis, Maryland, and it's always coffee time. So we give you permission to drink coffee in the afternoon. So here we go. My name is Shanetia, and I teach at Salisbury University in Salisbury, Maryland. And I do give a shout during the presentation on Twitter to keep your hashtag going, and it's all good. So go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So when Alex and Jason and I got together, it was like, you know what, let's kind of continue to unpack this whole personal writing and authenticity and seeing how young people experience writing and think about writing in different kinds of ways. So why does it interest me? I teach middle level and elementary pre-service teachers. This is a group that's now beginning to think about what it means to sit on the other side of the desk. They're thinking about, hey, I have all these great ideas in my head. I already know how to teach comprehension, or I know how to write in some cases, but now we're going to learn how to teach. So the course I'm going to talk about is the Integrated Reading and Methods Writing class. And in this particular class, we talk about writing pedagogy, and then my students actually do some writing. And so that's the aspect I'm going to talk about today. So next slide, please. So when we think about the inspiration for the two assignments that I'm going to talk about today, Donald Graves wrote this great quote, and it's one that I talk about in the very beginning of the course. It says, writing teachers draw upon three distinct areas of expertise. We must know our students. And why is that important? So we're thinking about pre-service teachers. They're beginning to know the importance of getting to know their students. Elementary, middle school teachers, at least the ones I always come and work with, they say, oh my gosh, I love working with young people. I love kids. So now we're thinking about why is that important for them and for us to get to know our students. Secondly, we must know how to teach. The whole point of the methods class is to learn how to consider and think about the art and skill of teaching. And then lastly, we must know something about writing. I tell my students, I said, when I learned how to ski, I didn't want to learn from someone who didn't know how to ski. It's the same thing about writing. We can't really teach writing if we don't write ourselves. So we're thinking about credibility and all those different kinds of writing, so we can empathize with our students, thinking about the struggles that we have, sometimes the vulnerability that Jason was talking about previously, and sharing our work with one another, and what does that look like. So that's one of the excellent quotes. So next slide, please. Another book that I love to think about is Daniel Pink's Drive, The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us. If you go on to YouTube, you can find an excellent RSA video that hits the highlights of this book. So he talks about autonomy. So when we think about autonomy and engagement, young people want engagement, the sense that self-directed is better. Sometimes as teachers, we just need to get out of the way. Let young people have the time and the space to think through things, to think about drafts in a different kind of way. We don't have to be on top of them all the time. Secondly is mastery. It's the urge just to get better. Daniel Pink talks about, it's like, why do we learn how to practice playing on the guitar during the weekends? Why do we learn how to play sports? Because we want to get better at it. So we're thinking about what do we need to do to get better at something. And then lastly, it's the purpose. That's the why. Why are we doing this? And the assignments that we're going to talk about, they said that they want to share a moment that's important to them. They want to talk about how can we think about this event that happened in our lives and why is it important? How can we unpack it? How can we think through it? What is the why? So that's Daniel Pink is a great article, great book too. Next page, please. A beautiful essay written by Patricia Carini. Here's the book. It's from the Starting Strong, A Different Look at Children, Schools, and Standards. The essay is called Meditation on Description. And I love this quote because the assignments I'm going to talk about with you today calls for students and for us to just stop and to describe a moment, to unpack it. And the one quote is from it, says, describing, I pause, and pausing, attend. Describing requires that I stand back and consider. Describing is to value. As readers and as listeners, and you'll see later, we want to value things. When we take time to attend to something important, that means we're showing value in it. Jason likes to talk about we're holding the space. We as a collective body are all engaged and just present in the moment. So this is why describing is really, really important. I strongly recommend this particular article. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we're going to talk about two types of writing. The first one is the occasion paper. If you've been with us before, you've heard me talk about why I love the occasion papers. First thing, as we know when we think about writing, we know that writing makes public our thinking. So we're thinking about what types of writing, how do we take these abstract thoughts in our minds and make it present in the most valuable way. The occasion papers, I tell my students, I said, have you ever had something happen in your life and you want to call your best friend or call your boyfriend or girlfriend or husband or wife, and they all nod their heads? I said, that's an occasion paper. I want you to take that moment and just write about it and share it with us in class. The idea is what makes it tellable, what makes it out of the ordinary. So Beach, Appleman, Hines, and Wilhelm in their book, Teaching Literature to Adolescents, talks about tellability. What makes a story tellable? You'll see that occasion papers also foster and generate classroom community. It helps us come together and we share really, really personal things with one another. And then lastly, we're highlighting the speaking and listening standards that sometimes get pushed aside sometimes when we're thinking about it, because we know that happens. We read, write, speak, listen every single day in classrooms. And then the second assignment is the memoir. My students get to experiment with the format. It doesn't necessarily have to be a prose format. Sometimes they can write memoirs in verse. They can do graphic novel format. So whatever format that they think fits the best for them to express their memoir, that's what I want them to do. Rich Wallace introduced me to the term emotional heat. So when they think about what to write about, they go back to this moment that says when they think back to it, they still feel happy or sad. It has emotional heat. It's intense, it is moving. So they take that moment and explode it. They take that moment and zoom in, or they describe. They stand back and consider. They find value in whatever this particular moment is, and we're going to explore that. Next slide, please. So I asked my students, and I said, in a 3-minute power rate, I said, tell me, I'm talking about occasion papers and memoirs, and I want y'all to tell me what you think. I said, don't put your names on it. We're just gonna talk about it and share with the whole wide world. And one person wrote, she said, the occasion papers we do in class are honestly the best. And my feelings were a little bit hurt because I said, I thought we did a whole bunch of excellent stuff, but I get how great the occasion papers are. So we were thinking about authenticity, because my students are in college. Most of them are juniors. I have a few seniors. And they say, in college, we rarely have the opportunity to share our lives in class. Another person said it gives students choices about their writing, which can be motivational. We want to get folks used to writing, to start thinking about writing. It's authentic. Jason talked about that in his session, as did Alex. We're sharing things that happens in our classrooms and the outside of our classrooms, and that's really authentic. Thinking about audience, because we share them in the beginning of class. I say, who has an occasion paper? And folks raise their hand. I share them too in Minor Corny, and they all laugh. And I have a great one from Monday, so I'm really excited to share. So I said, in sharing these occasions with one another, we have been able to laugh together about funny experiences and empathize with some who've had a bad day. You think about community, to say, hey, you know what? I got splashed by the bus this morning, and now my clothes are ruined. And you can talk about that in a safe space. Another person said it gives teachers the chance to learn more about their students' lives outside the classroom. We know that young people have so much going on in their lives outside of school. This gives us the opportunity to get to know one another. Gives us to kind of think about young people as more than a number or more than a level. We get to see who they are outside the classroom. So next slide. Think about purpose. Why do we do them? And I know why I do them, but here's some of the things that they said. They said occasion papers are a fantastic way to have fun while writing and also building classroom community. Another person said they are a great way to speak publicly and also can be a fun way to brag about something or get a load off your chest in a safe way. We've had people celebrate, like, hey, I made the team, or hey, I got this scholarship, or you know what, I just need to exhale about what happened to me yesterday. And we have a space, a safe space to do that. And I like the fact that they're using the word fun. I almost kind of think about engagement. So you're thinking about what it means to be in the flow. They're diving in, they're invested in these particular experiences. And voice is one of my favorites. It says, I like that we see everyone's interests and personalities and what they write and how they write. And the next person says, I get to hear funny, sad, or scary moments in their lives. And for a moment, I feel like I'm in their shoes. Like that one just gave me chills when I think about it. It's like, we all, as writers and readers, we want to be invested. We want to see what it means to be in someone else's shoes and kind of get a glimpse into their lives. And I just think that is just, I got a chill when I read it, and then when I typed it, and then when I decided right now. But I just think it's really, really beautiful when young people get to come together and say, oh my gosh, you were really, really funny, or you're really sarcastic, and I love it. So we get to see young people's personalities, which is cool. Next slide. So when we think about the memoir, Jason talked about this in his session, but now we're thinking about these folks in college. And it says, the idea of writing a memoir did not appeal to me at first, but I found that the process and experience are very valuable, not just for my skills as a writer, but for as a way to release memories that have been holed up. I find that as like therapy for me. The next person says, memoirs allow for a personal connection to be built between the reader and the author. One student wrote, she said, Dr. Clark, if you weren't reading this, I would have BS'd my way through this, but because I knew that you were going to read it, I'm going to tell you something true, which made me happy that we can share and form a community. So I could just consider and encourage all of you to do memoirs and occasion papers in the classroom. So I think the last slide is just a final thought. So do give us a shout on Twitter. Alex, you can go ahead and hit the next slide with all of our Twitter contacts. Give us a shout, and hopefully we can chat as we go on.
Awesome, guys. This is a great presentation. So much powerful advice for just trusting the kiddos, the kids in the classroom. And the whole idea, Shanetia, of teachers just get out of the way, right? Mm-hmm. Really great stuff. So continue the conversation, the EdCollabGathering space #13. Another plug from me to we.
It's far
Check
away.
it out.
So I just want to let everyone know that's tuned in right now that we do have a closing session coming up, and it is with Rusal Al-Rubail and Chris Lehman, and they are going to be doing a closing keynote, and it's entitled Caring for Our Kids, Supporting Immigrant and Refugee Children in Our Schools. So we hope that you continue to tune in, and thanks everyone for watching.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you,
Thank you,
everyone.
everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks for
Thank
tuning
you.
in.